Hello and welcome. I'm Jim Falk, and I'm so glad you could join us today. A popular guest on Perspectives Matter is Eric Weiner. He's an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and intrepid wanderer. Eric has spent the last 4 years tracing the footsteps of Benjamin Franklin, the only founder to sign all 4 documents leading to the establishment of the United States. And as we know, he certainly was a remarkable inventor. To bring Ben's wisdom and advice to the present, we are joined by Jim Crupi, widely acknowledged as a respected authority on leadership and business strategy. He is president and founder of Strategic Leadership Solutions. Eric, when I heard you were writing this book, I thought, oh, come on, do we need another book on Benjamin Franklin? What motivated you to write this?
Well, it turns out, Jim, we do need another book on Benjamin Franklin because, number one, there's so many aspects to the man that are often overlooked. And in my book, I try to take a very personal approach to Ben, and I call him Ben, not Dr. Franklin. I would say I encounter him on the page and have a relationship with him on the page, and I'm always looking for the wisdom that's applicable to today, the 21st century. I'm trying to bring 18th century Ben into the 21st century and see what can we learn from him.
So, Jim, was Eric successful?
Absolutely, and I don't say that just because he's here. You know, when you read what he's written and you start to think about how it applies to leadership today, the great thing about great leaders is they're lasting, and what they've learned survives generations, and the ability to bring that out and show it almost in a conversational way where you can look at it and reflect on it is very valuable.
Eric, did you have some sort of preconceptions of who Ben was? I'm going to be familiar with him now that I've read your book. And were some of those were some of those perceptions changed?
Absolutely. I had, I think, a pretty one-dimensional view of Ben Franklin, an almost cartoonish image of sort of the jolly, rotund founder flying his electrified kite, signing the Declaration of Independence, flirting with the ladies of France. All those are true, but there just was a lot more to him than that. Because his face landed on the $100 bill, that's one reason why we see him through really just a business lens almost exclusively. He's so associated with capitalism and business, and that was part of his life, but there was much more to his life. If he were to come back today, I think he would be a social entrepreneur, and that's really where his greatest genius was. His inventions were fabulous, the lightning rod, the Franklin stove, and many more. But really, it was these institutions he founded that are still with us today that is his greatest legacy. The Philadelphia Library, the first library in the United States, the Pennsylvania Hospital, the first hospital. Franklin invented the matching grant, a technique and strategy for raising funds that's still used today. So he was much more of a social animal and a social thinker than we give him credit for.
Let's talk for a minute about the fact that he really was a bibliophile. He loved to read so much. He didn't have a lot of wealth. In fact, in the book, you point out that he even became a vegetarian so that he could buy books. I would never do that as much as I like to read. But tell us more about that.
He loved to read. And he only had 2 years of formal education. So he was largely self-taught. I say in my book that books in general saved Ben Franklin's life and made him who he is. And I think that's true. And you have to realize growing up in Boston, population maybe 9,000 in the early 18th century, books were a rare and precious commodity. And Ben would sneak them, become a vegetarian, as you say, so he saved some money to buy some more. And he just devoured them. He absolutely devoured books. And that led to his his education and also to his career as a printer and publisher, writer, and editor.
Why was he pulled out of school at such a young age?
That's a good question. We don't have a definitive answer. Franklin writes in his autobiography that his father couldn't afford to keep him in school, but there was hardly any tuition or cost to school. I suspect it was because at the time, an elite education, going to Harvard, for instance, meant probably you'd end up as a clergyman. And from early on, Ben Franklin made it clear he was no fan of the church. So that was kind of a dead end. Perhaps that's why his father, Josiah, pulled him out of school. One thing that set Franklin apart is that he was a man of the people. He was a tradesman, what they used to call a leather apron man, because you wore a leather apron when you worked in the shop. And he worked with his hands, and he could always relate to, what today we'd call a blue collar worker. And the interesting thing about Franklin, Jim, is that, so on the one hand, he's the earthiest, most, grounded of our founding fathers. At the same time, he's a world traveler, can read, 3, 4, 5 languages and speak 1 or 2 of them passably. So in a way, he's the most cosmopolitan and international. At the same time, he's the most thoroughly American and blue collar.
Jim, do you think we put too much focus now on academic credentials? There's so much discussion. Do you need a college education? It costs so much. What might we learn about continuing education from Ben?
Well, the answer is yes, we do put way too much emphasis on academic education. The interesting thing we can learn from Ben is that he didn't need it, he didn't have it, he self-taught himself, he read a lot. People today don't read. They're not familiar with history, they're not familiar with context. Today, in a digital era, people tend to be more focused on content instead of context. And they don't have the curiosity he had, where you can spread so many different ways of looking at things. That's what you get from reading multiple different areas and topics. And that's what creates the innovation, right? Your ability to look at things from a perspective that others don't. The problem in academics is you become so specialized that you get locked into a way of thinking, you get locked into a perspective, and that prevents you from having a much broader lens. I think that the thing about Ben was he was target specific when he locked on something, but he was aperture agnostic.
Yes, I absolutely agree with Jim that Franklin was a generalist and a polymath, and we've largely lost that. Franklin also engaged in what I call analogous thinking. I'll give you an example. He's working on his electrical experiments, new field, but he's using what he knows in the world of business and economics to understand it and explain it. So the terms positive charge, negative charge, balanced charge, these terms we still use today came from Franklin because he's taking one field, business and economics, and applying it to another, electricity. And today, if you're a microbiologist, you're not likely to take, the world of art history or business to explain or understand the problems you're working on. And I think that's a loss, this ability, of fluid thinking to use what you know about concepts from one field and apply them to another.
That's really interesting. I mean, our education system almost puts people in silos, and it's hard to escape. So
I agree.
One of the things that you did in the book that I thought was so helpful was what were Franklin's 5 indispensable life strategies? And I don't know if we'll have time to go through all of them, but let's look at them as we can. And the first one, I'm trying now to live my life that way. What good shall I do this day? What good have I done today? Pretty simple, but how important?
That's how he began each day, writing down that question, what good shall I do today? And he ended each day with, what good have I done? I'm a big fan of paper planners. I've got lots of them, and they have little cues for them, like, what was your win today? Or what were you most productive at today? But a few of them ask me to write down what good have I done today? I think we've come a distance away from that. It's very simple. It is a very simple, outwardly directed metric for what you accomplished today. It takes you out of yourself. And that's what Franklin excelled at.
Jim, do you think we can get corporate leaders to think that way?
Well, I think some do, but most don't. They're so focused on the bottom line in the corporate world and focused on profitability. But that's not going to be a winning strategy, never has been, because you've got to focus on the culture that you're dealing with. One of the things I find with a lot of corporate leaders is they're not very reflective. They don't end the day by asking those questions. I myself think that life is not about being successful, it's about being significant. And the only way you can be significant is to do something for other people, which is what Ben did. He was always trying to solve problems. He was always trying to engage people to try to help get some focus around what he was doing. And he was a great listener. You can tell that, or you don't do what he does, and you don't even ask those questions. I mean, one of the questions that I ask myself at the end of every day, and I do it at the end of every day, there's two things that I add to what Ben does. One is, what could I have done better today to make a positive difference on the people I touched that I didn't do yesterday? And what am I grateful for?
And he really was a master at understanding people and figuring out how to get the most from them to build a relationship. And that's the famous, Ben Franklin effect of how he worked with people who might not agree with him. Eric, what is that?
So the Ben Franklin effect, as it's known today, is this quirk of human nature where if you want someone to like you, don't do a favor for them. Ask them to do a favor for you. And Franklin stumbled across this when he was clerk at the Pennsylvania Assembly, and one of the members of the assembly didn't care for him very much. And instead of kowtowing to him, Franklin said, "Oh, Mr. So-and-so, I hear you have a rare and precious book. I was wondering if I could borrow it for a few days." And the man said, "Sure." And then they got along swimmingly. So, and I should add that several recent studies have confirmed that this is in fact true. This is a proven way to get people to like you. And it sounds counterintuitive, but if you think about it, as Jim says, we want to be significant. Ben Franklin said we want to be useful. And if you give people an opportunity to be useful, to elevate themselves, they're going to like you. They're going to like you a lot. And usefulness, if you think about it, by definition involves other people. Like, you could be happy by yourself, I suppose, but you're not going to be useful for just yourself. That's selfishness, essentially. So it's outwardly directed. And I know business people today love to talk about scaling things. Does it scale? I don't speak like that, but I understand some people do. And Franklin understood that concept of scale. He would take an idea like, oh, it'd be great if we could, among my little club, he called the junto of like-minded people, if we could borrow books. But then he scaled it to, well, what if we got the whole community involved and started a library? So he was interested in leveraging good ideas and scaling them as much as possible.
So, Jim, you stand in front of huge audiences expressing knowledge about leadership. How would you think the audiences would react to if you said, you just need to be more useful?
Well, I wouldn't say it that way. I don't think. Because part of communication, one of the biggest lessons I've learned about leadership is it doesn't matter what I say. It only matters what you hear. So if I'm going to communicate with people, I better start speaking in a language that they understand. What they would understand is kind of taking a twist on that and saying, the only way you can be useful to those that you're leading is to serve something bigger than yourself. I mean, you have to have a purpose. You have to have a meaning behind what you do. And the great thing about Franklin was that what he did was he was so curious in helping solve problems. And by doing so, he became useful, right? And useful to a broad constituency of enterprises and ideas and all of that. So when you're talking to the business people, they get what purpose means because they relate it to vision. That's their word for that. But it is, I will admit, is the rare leader that looks at life and says, I'm doing what I'm doing to serve a higher purpose. By definition, when you do that, you become useful.
So, again, one of Franklin's indispensable life strategies was don't get too angry. And in your book, I realized just how often he was really in these conflict zones with family members, his brother, and so forth. And I love the fact that you wait 24 hours. How did he control his anger before he sent an email?
Right. So Franklin wrote placebo emails. They weren't emails, they were letters, but same idea. I call them placebo letters because you're right. He had a lot of reason to get angry, and he was human. He felt anger, but he was very careful not to express it or not to express it in a haphazard way. Let's put it that way. So he'd write an angry letter, and then as a rule, he would wait 24 hours before sending it. And 9 times out of 10, when that 24 hours was up, he did not send the letter. We still have them in the historical record, thank God. But he did not send them, or he softened them. And he saw no redeeming qualities to anger. He did not see it as a useful emotion or feeling. It could only really get you into trouble. And he learned that through experience. And that's somewhat different from, I think, from our attitude toward anger today, which is, you need to get it out. You need to confront people. Franklin was not a confronter. He used soft language. He always believed that the relationship is more important than the problem. A different approach that many of us take today, I think.
But with one exception, and that was with his son, William. And I think that was really a tortured relationship.
I've got to be honest, Jim, that is the saddest chapter in Franklin's life. He was great at forgiving people. He forgave people who sent him on wild goose chases. He forgave his brother who had mistreated him. He even forgave the British for the Revolutionary War, but he could not forgive his son William, who remained loyal to the British during the war, never changed sides, essentially fighting against his father, whose life was in danger, let's be clear. So Franklin wrote his son out of his will, and I don't know, it is sad that he couldn't see himself to forgive his own son. He wasn't a perfect man, Ben Franklin.
Well, another thing is about Franklin is we all know about Poor Richard's Almanac, but I didn't realize that he, to use one of your words, had a mask in so many other areas. And I'd like you to elaborate on that because he even wrote as a woman, he wrote as a young person, old person. I want to elaborate a bit on that, and then I would like Jim to talk about sort of how in the corporate environment today we sometimes have a persona that is perhaps artificial.
Well, Franklin did wear many masks. He, as a 16-year-old boy in Boston, he's writing as a middle-aged widow who he names Silence Dogood, and is so convincing as a middle-aged widow that these essays he's writing are being published in the New England Current newspaper, and men are writing in proposing marriage to Silence Dogood, not realizing it's 16-year-old Ben Franklin. And he wrote as the King of Prussia. He wrote as an African American. He wrote as women many times. He had an androgynous imagination, as John Updike said. And you use the word artificial, and I would just take exception with that, if I may. I think we all wear masks. Franklin just wore a few more than most of us. And it doesn't necessarily mean we're artificial. The 1960s guru and philosopher Alan Watts talked about being a genuine fake. And I think that's what Franklin was. I think he so occupied these roles and he wore these masks. He wasn't necessarily being artificial. He was just expressing different sides of himself, if you know what I mean.
So he was not a con artist, is what you're saying.
He was not a con artist. He knew what he was doing, playing a middle-aged widow or whatever role. He did it convincingly. And to get back to the useful term, it was useful to wear those masks, to express views. No one was going to listen to a 16-year-old with 2 years of education, in the newspaper, but they'll listen to the wise silence do good. So masking for Franklin was very useful, and I think in a way sincere.
But now, Jim, we see that and you feel like, okay, let's unveil the person and find out who they really are.
Well, I think the beauty of Franklin and the way he was raised and how he manifested his life was with many masks. So, in effect, it was part of his authenticity, right? You can get away with things when people know that you're switching roles for a purpose, trying to create a perspective. The leaders that I know are very effective when they're going to have a discussion with somebody and they lead with that discussion in the context of, I know what you're thinking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then lay out what they're thinking, right? A lot of leaders are, I find, I hate to say it, but they're insecure. They don't know themselves very well. They don't spend time really trying to understand who they are and what that means. And the discussion about anger I found to be instructive because most leaders have a hard time with that, right? They're so bottom line focused. They're so focused on what the end result is that when it doesn't happen, they get angry. And that's destructive. I was coaching one leader and I said, what do you think happens when you get angry? What do you think happens to the objective you were having in the first place about the challenges you were facing? And they look at you like, well, I helped make it happen. And I said, no, you created another problem. And what problem do you think they're focused on now? They're focused on you. They're not focused on trying to solve what you want solved or what you're trying to accomplish together. Because you've introduced another human dimension that now they have to deal with, and they have to deal with that first before they can move on.
Yeah, and I guess what they're doing, often the leaders are thinking about the next quarter or the next board meeting. It seems where I sit right now is that we really are facing sort of a crisis in leadership, whether it's political or in the corporate sector. Do you agree? I mean, are we just not seeing the leaders today that we might have seen definitely back in the 19th century, but even earlier, later?
Well, I'd say yes, we're not seeing it, but I would add something to that. I think the reason we don't see it is people aren't putting the camera on them. There are lots of really good leaders, and you find them in communities, you find them in institutions that aren't in the public light. Once you get into the public light and the camera's rolling, all of a sudden something happens, and people aren't the same, and they become the focus. Whether it's a celebrity culture, whether it's a social media culture. I mean, people today don't even know how to communicate. And a lot of these people, we're in a kind of a digital STEM society now where everybody wants to talk about STEM, right? And math and engineering and all of that. They don't want to talk about the other aspects of the humanities, for example, that make life so rich. I was interviewing a CEO of a cybersecurity company and I said, what do you need? He said, I need a pipeline. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, well, I need people who have technical skills, but I need people who have other skills. And I said, well, why can't you go to these schools that produce these great technologists, right? And his answer was, Jim, they're really bright, but they couldn't lead a group in silent prayer. I mean, they don't have the social skills. But Franklin could communicate across that because of the way he came up and the way he looked at people. That's the key factor.
So, Eric, I don't want to end the program without saying, one, I always enjoy your writing, and you make me laugh, and I learn things. But one of the things, and not but in the book, you talk about Ben Franklin is buff. I mean, we're looking at the picture on the cover. He doesn't look so buff there. He could be a swimming instructor. Tell our audience about that.
He is the only founding father inducted into the International Swimming Hall of Fame in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So there's a fun fact at your next cocktail party. Yeah, he was a fitness buff. He was a boxer. He lifted weights, and he swam. And this was a time when few people could swim. Not even sailors could swim. And as a 18-year-old, he's living in London, and a aristocratic gentleman saw him swimming across the Thames and tried to hire him, saying, come teach my kids how to swim. I'll pay you well. And, thank goodness he didn't take that job, because the course of his life might have been altered. Franklin once said, read books, but not too many. What does he mean by that? He means great that you read books, but experience is the best teacher. And in the end, that's how we acquire knowledge that sticks with us, through experience.
Good words to live by, and people will have to read the book to learn about fresh air baths, right?
Or bathing, air bathing. Yes.
Air bathing. Benjamin Franklin died on April 17th, 1790, at the age of 84 and 3 months. James Madison, in his biographical memorandum about Franklin, wrote this: I never passed half an hour in his company without hearing some observation or anecdote worth remembering. Being with Eric and Jim for these last 30 minutes makes me feel the same. Eric, thank you for your refreshed look at Ben. Jim, thank you for showing how Ben's wisdom and advice are just as applicable today as they were in the 18th century. And to all of you, thanks so much for being part of our program, where we talk about things that matter with people who care.